Herzlich willkommen in Berlin.
Welcome to Berlin. My name is Wieland Giebel and I'd like to introduce you to my hometown. Berlin Story. This is where Berlin starts today. History. Brilliantly illustrated books of then and now. Berlin in 12 languages and souvenirs. The time of East Germany. All about Berlin. It's more than you can imagine. 10,000 books, films, and an exhibition. And this is how the making of Berlin starts. Berlin was a rather late arrival on the stage of history. The Hohenzollern princes intended to build a moated castle between the villages of Berlin and Köln, but the local people flooded the building site and chased away the tax collectors, who didn't take long to come back, unfortunately. Where these high-rises stand was the village of Köln, and the Nikolaiviertel marks the original position of Berlin. Lime trees, Linden in German, were planted when the boulevard Unter den Linden was first laid out. Berlin had 6,000 inhabitants, and there was little to indicate that it would one day become a major metropolis. A tolerant city, Berlin was a refuge for French Huguenots and other persecuted religious groups from around Europe. Prince Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, founded a colony in what is now Ghana. In Berlin, he opened what later became the National Library. The next Prince-Elector, Frederick, transformed Berlin into a prestigious princely seat. He controlled a vast but scattered territory which he hoped to unify by becoming king. In 1701 he crowned himself at Königsberg in East Prussia. From then on the towns, courts and administrations under his authority would be known as Royal and Prussian. By this time 1 out of 3 Berliners was French. Queen Sophie Charlotte, for whom Charlottenburg Palace is named, invited artists and scientists to Berlin. Frederick William I smoking with friends. Thanks to his Spartan lifestyle, this king kept the state's coffers full, especially by cutting his ministers' allowances by 2/3. He was the first monarch in Europe to make school compulsory. His army of especially tall and athletic soldiers helped to deter wars. Frederick the Great playing the flute at Sanssouci Palace. A friend of Voltaire, he outlawed torture and censorship. He felt that people should be able to pursue happiness according to their own tastes and religion. This idea was revolutionary at the time in Europe. Frederick the Great fought 3 wars against Austria over control of Silesia. The outcome made Prussia a major European power. It was cosmopolitan and free-thinking. Sanssouci Palace was the king's favourite residence. In those days, the philosopher Immanuel Kant formulated the statement, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity." This is George Washington. On the table, a sword presented to him by Frederick the Great with a dedication from the oldest general to the most famous. Frederick William II. He met Wilhelmina Enke, his lifelong mistress, when she was 15, but he was not destined to marry her. Culture blossomed under his reign. Langhans designed the Brandenburg Gate, and Schadow topped it off with its famous quadriga. At this time, 40% of Prussians were Polish. Frederick William III stumbled into a war against Napoleon, despite his pacifist convictions. The French Emperor occupied Berlin and continued on his way to Russia. Queen Louisa, who opposed Napoleon, enjoyed great popularity and, like Princess Diana, became a legend after her early death. Under Frederick William IV, called the Romantic King, Prussia bordered on 28 small states, and the profusion of tolls became a handicap with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Some 200 domestic taxes were abolished to promote commerce and economic growth in the state. Scientists such as Alexander von Humboldt contributed to Berlin's growing reputation among the world's major cities. At the same time, the bourgeoisie was clamouring for more rights, which led to revolution. The king, who believed in rule by divine right, remarked to his friend the historian Leopold von Ranke, an ancestor of the Giebel family, "We've taken a tumble this time." Under William I, the Germans yearned for national unity. France, England and Italy were already nation-states. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, which was later the German national anthem, was sung long before the establishment of the empire. King William I became emperor thanks to Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who played a major role in German unification. The empire was founded in 1871 with Berlin as its capital. While Prussia was absorbed into Germany and declined in importance, Berlin developed at a tremendous rate, with the founding of many industrial firms. This was the making of Berlin. Germany outstripped France and Italy in a number of industrial fields. Emperor William II. His public appearances were staged like cinematic performances. The style back then was martial and authoritarian. Uniforms commanded such respect that an unemployed shoemaker was able to seize the borough of Köpenick's treasury simply by impersonating a Prussian officer. Business flourished around the turn of the century. Berlin's population tripled within 30 years, reaching 2.7 million in 1900. My grandfather, an architect working for the Prussian state, often referred to the Golden Age. That was before the clash of weapons was heard. In 1914, men marched off to war full of enthusiasm, but for Germany the First World War ended in defeat and revolution. In 1918, Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the German Republic. The Kaiser abdicated and went into exile in Holland. Thus ended the 500-year reign of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Historians will probably want to string me up when they see 7 centuries squeezed into 7 minutes, but hopefully you've gained an overview of Berlin's colourful history. What came then was quite confusing and lacked the foundation of a democratic tradition. Before the Nazis came to power, the Weimar Republic saw 13 chancellors in the space of 14 years. Politics aside, Berlin was more brilliant than ever. This was the era of Marlene Dietrich, George Gross, Kurt Tucholsky, Erich Kästner and Fritz Lang. People danced and took cocaine. The city attracted visitors from around the world. But many Germans felt humiliated by the defeat in the First World War and wanted revenge. In 1929, the Great Depression and mass unemployment. The Nazis' influence grew. Hitler came to power legally. Shortly afterwards, a fire destroyed the Reichstag, and in May of 1933 the Nazis burned books on what is now Babelplatz. Berlin was once home to more than 170,000 Jews. The Nazis organized a boycott of their businesses, fired all Jewish civil servants, and prohibited sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. In the 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom, the Nazis burned synagogues and looted Jewish shops. Many Jews were killed or hauled off to concentration camps. There were not many ways to escape. The US, England, Canada and Australia refused to admit more Jewish immigrants. The Germans followed Hitler into war. A few years later, Berlin lay in ruins. No electricity, no newspapers, many roads impassable. The city had only 2.8 million inhabitants left, 1.5 million less than before the war. And the remaining industrial potential was further reduced by 70% as plants were dismantled and sent to the Soviet Union. Germany was divided into 4 zones, with a demarcation line between the 1 eastern and 3 western zones. No men in the ruins, only women and children. West Berlin was like an island in the Soviet zone. The city itself was divided into 4 sectors. Initially, there was no wall. The Berlin Airlift, After the Soviets had blocked all surface routes to West Berlin, US General Lucius D. Clay reacted quickly and supervised the airlift to supply the city. The British also participated in the operation. The palace of the Hohenzollern kings in East Berlin. The royal palace had been the center of the city for 500 years. It suffered only little damage during the war, but the communist government decided to dynamite it to erase the imperial remnants of old Prussia. This led to an international outcry.
This was the year I was born in East Germany.
My parents, who lived in the countryside, wanted to flee to the west via Berlin. That was possible by city railway before the wall was built. This station, Treptower Park, was the last one before the border. The trains went on into the west to Tempelhof Airport. My mother was very nervous on that day, of course. She pushed my pram into the train car, and the automatic door closed, and that is how I arrived alone in West Berlin. She stood sobbing on the platform until the next train came to take her to me 10 minutes later. 3 million people left East Germany. The state could not stop them. Young, energetic, versatile people. In 1953, Russian tanks did stop the workers, who rose up against the Communist Party, which was demanding more work for less pay. There was unrest, but East Germany did not go under. In the early summer, the East German government declared that no one has the intention of building a wall. But just a few weeks later, no doubt you have seen these pictures. I remember this day very well. My 2 cousins came to visit us in the West and went back to East Germany with their parents that evening, to the other side of the wall. For 28 years our family was divided, but other people didn't wait that long. The calm after the storm in the 60s. The wall was hermetically sealed. People made the best of the situation in the East German capital. But in the West, students were demonstrating against the Vietnam War, the state of emergency law, and the newspaper magnate Axel Springer. The 1968 uprising marked a clear break in German social and political life. Young people were rebelling and calling their elders to account. No man's land in Berlin, the front city of the Cold War. Doors and windows on the east side were bricked up. Several hundred people died trying to flee to the west. In 1989, East Germany celebrated its 40th anniversary. Most people had adapted to the system, but only superficially. Suddenly, everything changed. History was no longer made by the rulers, but by the masses, chanting, "We are the people." Tension was also high in the West. East German border guards were attacked at Checkpoint Charlie. I was on the scene as a reporter. On the same day, the first opposition party was founded in an East Berlin church. The area in Berlin Treptow was swarming with state security officers. I was the only Western reporter to cover the event. What a scoop! The paper that I worked for ran the story on the front page. 2 months later, the wall collapsed. It happened like this. First hundreds, then thousands of East Germans had taken refuge in the West German embassies in Prague and Budapest. They wanted to defect. Hungary opened its border to Austria and the West, and the people were free at last.
Ich hab's geschafft, kann ich nur sagen. Ich bin ein freier Mensch.
The Berlin Wall had lost its meaning, and soon it was breached. At first, it was difficult to guess what consequences the event would have. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had warned the East German government already before the fall of the wall, life punishes those who come too late. The wall was demolished and pieces of it sold as souvenirs. Germany was reunified on October 3, 1990, with great celebrations along the Boulevard Unter den Linden. This was the end of communism, which had collapsed after 70 years of existence. Capitalism had triumphed. But over the 10 years that followed, the costs of reunification amounted to 500 billion euros. The people of East Germany had been promised a shining future, but 2 million of them had to move to the west to find work. Once again, young, energetic and versatile people. Confrontation of the political blocs during the Cold War had been especially bitter in Berlin. It was also here that the chapter of communism was closed. Ten years later, little had changed in the former West Berlin around Savignyplatz. It was as if time had stood still. Bourgeois Berlin takes it easy. The trendy neighborhoods may now be on the east side, but it's still possible to enjoy a good meal here, in an almost Mediterranean atmosphere. The Kurfürstendamm and the neighboring streets are a shopper's paradise. The great international fashion names are here. A positive development after the peep shows and raunchy bars that reigned while the wall still stood. In the past, few visitors noticed the wonderful late 19th century facades. Between 1961 and 1989, no one cared whether Berlin was beautiful or not. After all, we had the wall. A very lively neighborhood, the Kudamm is being modernized and remains the prime shopping avenue of the capital. A major bookstore has taken over the space once occupied by a global fast food chain, an unusual victory for culture. A barbecue in Tiergarten Park, a tradition that dates back to the time of Frederick the Great. The revolutionaries of 1848 also liked to gather here under pavilions on the site where the House of World Cultures stands today. More traditional culture is found around the Matthäikirche and Mies van der Rohe's new National Gallery. The Culture Forum was built in the spacious architectural style of the 1960s. It also includes the Museum of Decorative Arts and the Philharmonic Hall, where conductor Simon Rattle has followed in the footsteps of Furtwängler, Karajan and Abbado. Modern development is much denser, however, as can be seen today on Potsdamer Platz. This is how the site looked just a few years ago. Flooded building sites are not new in Berlin. Remember the Hohenzollern and their tax collectors. The tradition continued at Potsdamer Platz as divers went down to pour the foundations for the high-rises and a multi-level underground railway station. Architectural tastes and fashions also changed. The Sony complex is arranged around an American-Asian-style plaza. The futuristic ensemble also incorporates a 1906 ballroom taken from a nearby hotel. Across the street, the high-rises continue the European urban tradition. In the 1920s, Potsdamer Platz was Europe's busiest junction. This is Berlin's regional parliament, which faces the Martin Gropius building, probably the city's most beautiful exhibition hall. History seems to be concentrated here. The wall. These remains were preserved in Niederkirchner Straße. The first question tourists ask is always, where can I still see the wall? The East Side Gallery near Ostbahnhof Station features some beautiful murals, but definitely doesn't communicate the grim reality of the wall. And this is the place where the Cold War crystallized, Checkpoint Charlie, the border crossing reserved for the Allies. John F. Kennedy did not give his famous speech here, however, but at the City Hall in Schöneberg.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The Palace of Tears. The name refers to the heartbreaking scenes that used to take place here when East and West Germans parted at Friedrichstraße station when their visas expired at midnight. Modern buildings and neoclassical architecture on Gendarmenmarkt, Berlin's most beautiful square, where we encounter Karl Friedrich Schinkel. Gendarmenmarkt, with a statue of Schiller at its center, includes the German cathedral where an exhibition on German history is presented, the Schauspielhaus Theatre, a work by Schinkel, now a concert hall, and the French cathedral. Schinkel shaped German neoclassicism, and even today it's impossible to build in Berlin without making reference to this architect. Schinkel's works include the Neue Wache, the Old Museum, the Architectural Academy, and the Schauspielhaus, all of them built between 1816 and 1830. The Jewish Museum in the Kreuzberg district, the building by Daniel Liebeskind with zinc sheeting, is a museum of German Jewish history. Riemer's Hofgarten was built more than 100 years ago as a model residential complex when Kreuzberg was in its heyday. Another face of Kreuzberg is Little Istanbul, full of Turkish shops and businesses. 400,000 foreigners live in Berlin, half of them Turks. The 3-day-long Carnival of Cultures takes place every year at Pentecost and attracts huge crowds of onlookers. What a colourful spectacle! Young people generally prefer the older neighborhoods like Friedrichshain or Prenzlauer Berg and Kreuzberg. Exotic-smelling smoke fills the air in the park on the former no man's land along Bernauer Straße. Back to the Mitte district. Time flows quickly here. The Neptune fountain in front of the mayor's office in the Red City Hall. You also know this building, the Reichstag, remodeled by Norman Foster, a symbol of the new Berlin. The building is dedicated to the German people, and they would like to play soccer again on its lawn, as they did in the past. The Chancellor works just opposite in this concrete building. The parliamentary administration offices are close to the Quadriga atop the Brandenburg Gate. It's the symbol of German unity. Let's remember.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Di Brandeburgo c'è stata una battaglia con gli idranti fin dalle 4 di questa notte. Ora I militari.
Berliners argue about which new building fits in best, the Hotel Adlon or the other new buildings on Pariser Platz. Every day, an average 6.8 demonstrations take place in Berlin. Most of them are held on Unter den Linden, where Frederick the Great's equestrian statue stands. In 1997, a street festival celebrated the boulevard's 350th anniversary. The opera was the first building commissioned by Frederick the Great after his coronation. Culture for the capital. Later on, the king had St. Hedwig's Cathedral built right in the center of Protestant Berlin to appease the Catholics from newly annexed Silesia.
You will also walk by the Kronprinz Palais, where the division of Germany was signed and determined.
The former Royal Library, today an annex of the university, and Bebelplatz, where the Nazis burned books in 1933. Just opposite, the Humboldt University, associated with such names as Fichte, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt, Marx, Einstein, Virchow, Planck and Sauerbruch. The Neue Wache, a work by Schinkel, shelters a Pietà by Käthe Kollwitz. This shrine is dedicated to the victims of war and tyranny. The former Arsenal, a Baroque building, now houses the German Historical Museum. Schinkel also designed the Palace Bridge with its white marble statues inspired by Greek mythology. The Bertelsmann Media Group has built its Berlin headquarters here. The Friedrichswerder Church, another work by Schinkel. The Lustgarten, a square bordered by the cathedral with the Hohenzollern crypt and its tombs, the former site of the royal palace, and the old museum, also designed by Schinkel. The Bode Museum and the Pergamon Altar, Berlin's most famous archaeological monument, brought from Asia Minor. The Ishtar Gate, built in Babylon in the 6th century BC, was reconstructed here. The Princess Group, a graceful work by the sculptor Johann Gottfried Schadow, is exhibited in the neighbouring Old National Gallery. It's not every day that there's a party in the National Gallery, but you can always have fun at the Hackische Höfe. A bridge leads from the Museum Island, which is a World Heritage Site, to the Hackische Höfe complex. Architect August Endel described his work as the pinnacle of democratic urban exuberance. The former synagogue on Oranienburger Straße is surrounded by start-up companies, bars, artists' courtyards, and Jewish businesses and institutions. That too is reunification. Newcomers have always enriched Berlin. Today the city is once again attracting pioneers. Berlin's young, cool image is a good selling point. We are now seeing the emergence of a new type of citizen, of new intellectual resources, once again thanks to newcomers. Trendsetters, policymakers, young creative people. In short, anyone who has a project they're passionate about. Because in Berlin, everyone's allowed to pursue happiness according to their own tastes. Energy and passion, versatility and a chance for everyone. That's our way of life. Welcome to Berlin.